recording is on progress with with Grant, the returning champion of AI data center and hardware conversation. And since last time Grant was in this podcast, we've had many interesting topics of discussion in between offline. But Grant, I think if I could reintroduce you, it'll be to say in our last discussion, in our last podcast episode, you created an analogy of electricity used to generate in our basement in a silo, and then eventually it became centralized for cities to take over the electric grid, and then the electric grid became cheap, accessible, affordable, and widely used. And you analyze that with the data, right? The clouds, as in, data used to live in your basement. Now it lives in the cloud. Now it lives in a centralized location. And because it does now, its data is far more accessible and data is far more usable, as in you have access to it and it has some availability for you to do what? Artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's a beautiful analogy. And if I may, I don't walk around with a badge that says AI subject matter expert or data scientist or, machine learning expert. I would like to be recognized as a person that does conflict management, right? That's the badge that I would like to wear everywhere I go. Conflict manager, conflict analysis, conflict researcher, right? So when you put that perspective in my head, it created this a bridging between gap of knowledge, right? So, for example, I can talk about electricity all day long. However, to hear you say that, it made so much sense that because of utilization of electricity makes everything else happens. We don't think about electricity that often because it's not in our basement. It's somewhere far away. Just like data is sitting somewhere far away. I mean, I'm used to those days where you had the hard drive that you had to carry around with you because that's where your data lived. But now data lives so far away that we're not so accustomed to it, and we don't think about it just like we don't think about electricity. But what we do is it because of something like power goes out, right? So, um, Grant, I just want to start off with that because I think we have so much to unpack here. And welcome back to
Well, I'm glad to be here as Ashif. I love the word Ashif. I couldn't wait to say it, right? Ashif. People don't know because he doesn't tell everybody, but he is actually a relative of the god of thunder. I'm just going to say you're a relative. We're talking about electricity. We're talking about thunder. Ashif is in that world. That's probably why he does what he does, and he does it so well, so very, very well. But you are exactly right. And as we were, right now we're in this AI craze. And I just love the fact that it had to be about 2 years, maybe 2 years plus. We had this discussion on your podcast. You just got going. It was you was lucky. We had this great conversation. We're talking about AI and how we were seeing it, how it's going to grow, kind of where it sits today. And are we going to have a Terminator type, episode at some point in time and all this type of thing. And it was interesting because this was pre-open AI. There wasn't this big buzz about generative AI yet. And we were having this discussion. And I always go back and say, man, we were just talking about this. And now we've got this humongous adoption of generative AI and chatbots where the normal everyday consumer can utilize it and it can see how it can operate. Like, wow, the speed of getting the result is incredible. It really, truly is. But then how do we get to a use case? How do we use this? And before we unpack how we even use this, you brought up another good point. How does it actually work? Because what we're entering into is a different field of how we utilize information technology. And the fact is this, it is now a utility. Just like your water comes to your house from another source somewhere else, you're not making your own water. Before you had to have, you had to be very close. This is why cities started around rivers and streams and lakes because they had to be very close to the water source. Not anymore because you can get it pumped in. Same type of thing with electricity you just talked about. Well, you had generators in these old buildings downtown that would generate electricity down in the basement. That's how it worked until they built out the grid, and then boom, we have electric. Now you get a bill every month from the electric company. Well, before you were generating your own company, and some hospitals still have their own generators in the basement because if you lose power, you still got to be able to run your systems with some kind of electricity because it's mission critical and life saving. So there's still generators out there, but it's not as many. Now we're talking about data centers and we're talking about information technology, where when we first started out, a lot of these data centers were within the enterprise. It was in your silos, on-prem, as they say. It's on-prem,
Right.
right? You had your
Right.
server stack and your storage arrays, and all the logic was right there in your building. Well, that's changing, right? And it has been changing since the advent of cloud computing, where cloud computing say, hey, you can consume resources as a service. So you know who started that was AWS. They said, man, I got all this
Mhm.
compute power, Amazon. You're like, and it's just sitting there. Why don't we sell this downtime? And then boom, you had cloud computing kind of taking off because you had, servers that were downtime. So they started to realize this without even really being intentional about building it. But here we are, we have it. And then we had another thing that happened, right? We had this thing called COVID. And when we had this thing called COVID, we had to all step back into our own homes, into our own worlds, and we needed to see what we can do. How are we going to communicate? And we had no idea that our systems, our worldwide data center systems, could support a worldwide load of communication. And that was a big aha. Like, we actually can. It wasn't a lot of outages. You're like, oh, you remember when people remember, on your cell phone, maybe some of you remember, where you get a lot of static and things like that when you're calling long distance. It was kind of a bad experience. No longer anymore, because you have much greater bandwidth that's available that you didn't have before. You got cell towers. People don't understand how this actually works. So we're
Yeah. Yeah.
sitting on top of a grid of natural resources, of electricity, of HVAC, which is air conditioning, all these things to make this thing work. I say all that to say this is that AI is that application layer that is a game changer for the use of compute on a worldwide level that we've never seen before. And I don't think we can anticipate the adoption that we've had and the uses that people are utilizing this type of technology. So I want to give it back to you, because I know you're just like, yeah, this you did. Let me ask you, did you see this happening 2 years ago when we had the first podcast?
Honest answer will be no. No. What I have seen is the logistics, the truth logistics that, beyond the hype, there's always this groundwork that it was necessary, and the groundwork playing out to, work itself out eventually. That eventually is what I didn't see, right? When I said eventually, I meant maybe 3, 5 years down the road. But there was this like three stars lining up, that Goldilocks zone moments, right? That 5 star BDM coming together, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
that
exactly. I know what you
that
mean.
one moment, that one moment when you had Chat GPT being subscribed by 100 million people overnight, like, I didn't see that coming at all, right? I didn't see the hunger and the thirst for a text-based AI to be so popular that all the CIOs and CTOs that were sitting on the shelves, now they're ready to, you know, actualize this, right? And one other thing that I haven't seen is the fact that how much of a budget these corporations were not investing into this. All of a sudden, they were, right? They came out in public and said, "We are investing in AI. We're developing AI. We will." So one thing that I have seen for sure is the hardware development of it, as in the semiconductor chips, as in the chips that were being asked to be manufactured, which US had an advantage in, because at that point Intel already broke grounds in Arizona. They were not talking about what Taiwan makes as far as hardware goes. They were talking about developing chips for AI, right? Now, in what purposes would these chips be manufactured for is something that, you cannot predict, because you don't know who the buyers are at that point. right? But if you look at today's market and you see Nvidia and Nvidia's Blackwell, chips and all the orders for A100, H100 semiconductors, or sorry, GPUs, uh, you see a different vision that you couldn't have seen before. Prior to that, you had hardware, but no orders for this hardware out in the open. Now you see an out open war for these GPUs to be delivered, right? Like people are scrambling to find these GPUs. So it's the only thing that I probably saw, but ChatGPT and OpenAI has broken the any future predictions that I couldn't have had, because at the time that we were talking, it was GPT-1, GPT-2. I was already using text large language model. Like even if people don't know about large language model back then, they were using Grammarly. Well, there's lots of AI behind Grammarly, anyways, right? And people were already using keyboards in their iPhone. That was a lot of machine learning. So we we had lots of machine learning features that we are not so familiar with, as in we use Google search on a daily basis, but we never call it a machine learning. We don't think about the decision tree that learns on machine learning behind Google search. So I had lots of these insights about machine learning. I just didn't know when it will pop to a point that you will see lots of money flowing into it for the purchases, for the purchase reasons and acquisition reasons. So um, I think that's the answer. I didn't see it coming the way it did. It for sure took me off track. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it took a lot of people off track because we just got off this roller coaster ride. We came out of COVID. We started to see, we could utilize a load like interactive communication on a lot of different levels, whether it was video, whether it was audio or text, anything like that. And then there's big metaverse buzz. Everybody knows the metaverse buzz, and that's AR and VR, virtual reality, mixed reality, all these type of things. People are talking about industry 4.0. They're talking about internet 3.0, and they seem like this was the big emerging tech. You had Facebook changing their name to Meta. You're like, all right, we're all gonna live in these virtual worlds,
Right.
because they're so
Of
cool
course.
that you can
Yeah.
do things you can't do in the physical world. But they misstepped because of human adoption. They didn't realize, yeah, we've been locked up for 2 years, and all of a sudden I found out we could be outside again. Why am I going to lock myself up into a
In
little
the virtual.
yeah, visor like that? Like, no, I'm not. I don't want to do that. That's cool, but I don't need to do that every
Right.
day. So they're
Right.
trying to step, and there's a lot of investment dollars going into it. So
That's
getting
right.
back to your point about artificial intelligence, and I'm gonna give it to you a little bit from my lens as someone who's been in information technology for 25 years and seen a lot of different tech come in and go out. Is that this is why I think it's such a game changer. We have been dealing with information, data, information technology to store and move data around. The transportation of data. That's what information technology is about. We're now moving into this world of intelligent technology. That means the technology of itself has a capability of being causal in effect, being able to explain how it gets to answers, but maybe give you a different output than what you programmed it to do. That talking about machine learning and things like that. That is a metamorphosis. Intelligent technology is what we're moving into as a fabric that we're going to be used to. You're being used to talking to your Alexa app. You're getting used to talking to your Google app. You're getting used to getting right answers back. That's never happened. If we've seen it in science fiction, and a lot of these things in science fiction is now become fact. So we're starting to realize that our imaginative selves, even though we it may not be visible at this point, that imagination, there's some fact in it. You look at what happened with Star Trek, right? The communicator. Well, who doesn't have a communicator these days? We call it a cell phone, which is really a mini computer, right? That's what it is. Or if you're doing any kind right now, video conferencing. Remember that if anybody's watching the old Star Trek shows, you sit there, they hit a button, then boom, Captain Kirk is on the doing video conferencing. He's like, wow, man, I can't wait to do that. So now we're doing video conferencing, right? Only thing we haven't been able to do is be able to transport the transporter. Well, that would be like, wow, right? We could need a
Yeah,
transporter.
yeah.
So I think we're fundamentally, as a group of the human species, is moving from information technology to intelligent technology, which is a game changer.
Uh, I think there's so many things that I want to hit on, but let's kind of work backward from Star Trek all the way to the people side of things. Like you mentioned, metaverse wasn't as big as it intended to be, but let's just call it what it is, right? The Star Trek. If it wasn't for the beaming, Star Trek would never exist. Because if you cannot extract people out of the ground from another planet with your ship, you don't have a show anymore. Every day you will have a new cast. So beaming was super necessary, even though it was unrealistic. So I think, if we were to go back and say, how do you thread that into the people side of the equation? Well, the people really have to imagine what is necessary, how to imagine, how to manage their expectations. So just like in Star Wars, you had all these things that you can look at and say, well, that's possible in physical space because the gravity will allow that. But how does beaming work? Well, maybe quantum, but you have to imagine that somehow to make it work, right? So on the people side of things, we really have to enable people with these sort of information, right?
Mhm.
Take this for example. This podcast is a sort of voice to say you don't have to be educated in a 4-year school to go to data science or computer science school for 4 years. If you listen to this podcast, did your imagination change a little bit, right? Were you able to imagine that? And if you are able to imagine, are you able to take action based on the new information that you've got? And I want to point out how the metaverse didn't really work out because that cross section between space and time. I think AI is about to come to that same conclusion as well, right? Because if you think about it, it's a hype cycle no matter where you look at it, right? No matter what industry, no matter how you look at it, from the data perspective, it's a hype cycle. And there will be a clear winner and loser when the dust settles, correct?
Mhm.
So these dusts that are about to settle, it will be ignited by the people that adopts it. As in, people that adopts it, how much adoption and how their adoption has worked out in their favor will be the metrics for us to figure out who actually won, right? Um, so what do I mean by all these people adoption? Because people adoption, people are going to adopt, right? But by the time you implement it, and if people are able to imagine how to work with AI, and they are trained, they are well aware of how the AI system works. How is it different from what they used to do, which is on the keyboard? And I want to hit
Mhm.
on that point as well. Are we going to have keyboard in the future? And is your workforce willing to adapt to a world that didn't have keyboards anymore? They have to use their voice. And do they understand that this voice capability is far more necessary than the keyboard? Do they know how to articulate what they need from the AI and how to articulate to the AI without thinking, oh, this is just like my friend from kindergarten, right? You can't just talk to an AI any way you want. You really have to have these way of thinking the way AI does, or the black box of AI, as we call it, right?
Mhm.
So you see where I'm getting with this? This is a lot to
Yeah.
unpack, but the people psychology side of things is just like metaverse, just like with blockchain, just like with websites, just like with any technology, the digital transformation we have, AI is going to go through the same. But AI really is far different than all these other digital transformations we went through. And I want to go back to the people point again. Is that prior to this, there was a user and there was developers and nothing
Mhm.
else in between, in my opinion, right? If a developer developed it, the user used it, and they just moved on with their lives. They didn't really have to understand how the developers developed it. They just moved on. It
Mhm.
worked because it was logical. It had no, let's call it what it is. When it's logical, if it's called if then this, right? If this
Right.
happened, do this. But with AI, the simple change, but it's a very widening gap between technology that we are used to versus what we're going to have. It's called if then else, right? When you call it
That's it.
else, it
Yeah.
changes the variable to a trillions and millions. What is means else, right? What else can we get from this? The variable changes. So going back to the people again, if people don't understand these little distinctions, they are definitely going to see an AI but not use that AI. And seeing an AI and not using an AI means that not everybody's going to win. Let's say, for example, you're an enterprise, you spent all these millions and billions of dollars in AI, but your people are not adapting to it, or
Yeah.
the implementation that they have, they're not really seeing any good use cases of it. Think about it from the cybersecurity perspective. You implemented all the cybersecurity tool, but your endpoint vulnerability was your end users. Your end users who are giving away your cyber domain, right? The fault between chair and the keyboard, right? I really appreciate you are separating the distinctions between the information system and intelligence system, because that makes a whole lot of difference in people's mind of understanding. You no longer are just gathering information through an information system. You really are engaging with your intelligence system using your own intelligence. And great point, by the way. Thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah, critical thinking. One of my favorite courses, I remember this in high school. This is high school for me. It was a while ago, and I always loved it. But I got a C in it. But it was my favorite class
Of
because
course.
it was applied knowledge. It wasn't just get 1 + 1 = 2 and show my math type of thing. It's about looking at an ideology. How did you achieve, even if you said, you know what, an elephant can balance itself on the side of a mountain by sitting on its trunk? Be like, really? And you could show that through all kinds of formulas and whatnot. What they're looking at is your thinking. How are you applying the principles of gravity, the principles of light and sound, and the principles of physical life to theoretically get to a point where you actually see an elephant balancing itself on a cliff using its trunk? Well, we all know that through animation, you can do that, right? Through imagination,
Mm-hmm.
of course, you can do
Right.
that, right?
Right.
But to have the critical thinking of utilizing facts, physical realities to get to that point, that's big. I think that was really in the science world, right? Where a small community of people could appreciate that kind of intelligence, that kind of thinking. Now, this is a bigger playing field where even myself, I can sit here with my educational attainment and I can access information and intelligence and facts and things that I never could before utilizing a chat box like a generative AI. That can never, so now my intelligence factor goes up exponentially. Now, if you multiply that by 8 billion people, you have a major shift in awareness on the human at the human level that never happened before, right? Those resources and everything that we're talking about. Wow, now you're dealing with not so you're talking about intelligent machines, yes, but now we have a more enabled, more intelligent society because you have to be an intelligent society in order to operate an intelligent machine, like a vehicle, like a car, like a cell phone, like all the other devices we take for granted that we utilize all the time. So now we can now engage. Now, I say all that to say this, to go back to really what I want to talk about. We have chief information officers, we have chief digital officers, we have chief technical officers. They're starting to see this framework that they've set up, these tech stacks, now potentially being obsolete. Some of them, technical debt. I start to see my technical debt probably rising. That technical debt is not always the systems, it looks at the people. Are my people trained? Do I have AI data scientists? Do I have AI data engineers? What is the gap between what I have on my bench of engineers and technicians and what I truly need to compete in this new world of intelligent systems? What do you think about that?
That's the key to what we always talk about in this podcast is that people, process, and technology. So if you have a process that you're interested in, and the people that's in your bench are not necessarily accustomed to that process, how do you get them involved in that process? Because once you engage the people in the process, that process gives birth to whatever that is, be it a service, be it a system, be it a technology, be it AI. however you want to call it, right? But I think one unique aspect of AI that is really need to be understood by CIOs, CTOs, and CDOs, specifically that C-suite of people, is that you cannot have AI as a technology. AI is a process,
Mm.
and that's a big distinguishment between the distinguishing factor between the technologies that you're seeing that you buy from Microsoft, OpenAI, ChatGPT, whatever they call it. But if you don't see that as your process that you have to have adopted to internally in-house, you're going to miss a big picture. You're going to miss the whole forest for a tree. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So you got people, process, and technology. So look at the process and say, is AI a process, or am I looking to deliver an AI solution, right? But if you weren't delivering an AI solution, how would you do it? And that's your sort of that imagination and labeling things correctly. Because what's happening, and you can look back in the Silicon Valley history for the last 15 years, the experience has always been the same. I wanted I wanted to deliver an AI, so I went and got a bunch of data scientists and data engineers from big universities and paid them $300,000, $400,000. At least kept them on the bench to deliver those AIs, right? Mislabeling because they thought AI was a deliverable, not a process, right? So when this data scientist came in and they bought the hammers with them and they found nails everywhere, say they broke a bunch of things, but they never delivered anything because they were
Mm.
asked to deliver AI. You don't deliver AI, you build a process of AI. You develop a data strategy, you develop your AI strategy, and whatever comes out of it is what you use and you build on that AI capability, right? As in it's scalable and sustainable, right? So this has happened already for the last 15 years. And you can ask around Google, you can ask around any company that you can think of that does machine learning. They will tell you their first burning experience with AI was that they hired lots of people, but these people couldn't deliver anything, right? Because
Mm.
these people were considered a delivery guy, not a process guy. So, it, and the big picture that was missing in this whole equation is that data scientists really didn't know who the other people were, right? So when you have people on the bench already that is a subject matter expert in your business process, in your workflow, especially the data owners, right? Not everybody's a data owner. Just because you have a server doesn't mean you have the key to that data, right? So there's data owners that never even showed up to the meetings, and these data scientists had no idea where to work on or where to
Mm.
start on. So they had all these Excel sheets and all these dashboards, yet nothing got delivered. And that is a through and through stories of all sorts of AI machine learning disasters that we have seen. And Gartner points it out to a point that, they used to call it 87% of AIs never got deployed. And
Wow.
13% of that did, they underperformed, right? There's a lot of jokes about this 87% and 13% story. But the point is, you can tell because there's a lot of AIs out there, quote unquote AI products that do not perform. They do not perform. They do not perform very well. It's underwhelming, right? But one that does, it took a long, long time. And case in point is ChatGPT, which has been around since 2015, if I may say so. Right? OpenAI started in 2015, and they first delivered probably around 2020. That's a long time to be not making any money and just keep developing tools and products and researching. It goes into that understanding that AI is not information technology. AI is part of intelligence technology, right? And it requires a time to grow, sort of like an infant child that cannot start walking in 6 months. You need
Mm.
to grow it to a point where you can walk and then starts maybe speaking, right? So to be an intelligent, you really have to give it some time and work on it in house, not necessarily raise it in somebody else's house and bring it to your house and expect it to work just the way it should have, right? So you have all of these things to unpack, but it just goes back to what we are talking about over and over. People. If you don't upskill the people, if you don't allow them to imagine things using the knowledge, their domain knowledge, their subject matter expertise, their capabilities for your organization already, you are really tapping into the wrong type of people, as in people that don't know nothing about who you are as an organization. So upskilling is the key. And don't get me wrong, We are in the business of smart AI community, where we are enabling the workforce to understand AI differently. So we'll talk more about the smart AI community at the end of the podcast. But I do have a specific question for you, right? And that goes back to the servers and the hardware piece, right? So pivoting a little bit into the hardware side of things, what are you seeing these days with the hardwares? As in, is something exciting that you're seeing, or something that you're tracking very closely, or what's going on in the database world?
That's an interesting discussion. And it's big because we didn't really know where this was going. And we were feeling just like, again, going back to the COVID time period and then coming out, what are the emerging technologies that are coming out of this, and what are the pivots that industry is doing? There was a lot of pivot going into public cloud. There was pivots into hybrid co-location plus my on-prem plus some public cloud. That's just on a compute storage level. That's your infrastructure platform. What is that looking like? When you start to introduce something like AI, what happens is that your compute cycle is growing exponentially. That you never really saw that particular aspect happening. And because now it's not just in the public domain, it's now in the enterprise domain, where you must be able to get information very, very quickly. And if you can use information to get to a decision support, that's huge. Everybody's going to want that. There's a huge demand for decision support. I need to understand what this data means. See, before we were just having a lot of data. This happens in the healthcare realm. I'm big into healthcare. Right? I got a ton of data. But what is the data telling you? What does it mean? So now we have all these compute cycles trying to tell us to decipher the data, and utilizing these AI engines are now consuming a lot, a lot of power. I wanted to make that
Oh man.
emphasis to people understand. It sounds cool when you put in a prompt into one of these AI chat box and you get an answer and it spits back, a whole formula, over 3 paragraphs within 3 seconds or less. How does that happen? That's a lot of compute power that is happening in rapid sequence. And so in the data center world, that's a lot of blinking lights. And what does that blinking light mean? It goes back to what Ashif said earlier. That means there's a lot of air conditioning that's happening. There's a lot of water that's being consumed. There's a lot of just basic hardcore electricity that's happening. There's a lot of what we call wide area networking that's happening. That's your telecommunications grid that's worldwide. Remember, you can do compute anywhere on the planet, is all connected now, right? So these are huge cycles, and they're starting to look at, hey, do we build data centers underwater because it'll save on electricity and the consumption that's needed, to run these data centers. I remember when they were running around and they were making bitcoins, right? Making these actual minting, as they would call it. Well, that consumes a lot of power. That's the problem, I would say, when you start looking at what does the blockchain really mean. That means that every single node within that entire network is simultaneously upgrading. That's a lot of compute. Yeah, I keep saying that because I want people to understand. That's why you have certain countries that will shut down minting. Like, hey, you can't mint because you are affecting the electrical grid. You understand? You have compute, you have the infrastructure of information technology, but that sits on top of an electrical grid, that sits on top of a physical grid, of water, just basic stuff, that creates that reality. So there right now, and getting back to your other point about GPUs and these big buzzword we hear these days, rare earth minerals. and these essentials, and why Taiwan and certain areas of the world are so important because of the way that we're utilizing computing services and how much density is on a chip can you actually get to. There's Moore's law. There are physical realities that we cannot exceed at this point as as physical beings, as human beings, that we as we understand physics. But, and I'm going to say this word, you may like it, may not like it, but it's true. Quantum computing, the QC, the cubic, right? It's an answer because it's a different way
Yeah,
of handling the compute cycles. So we're reaching a point of can we continue on this hype cycle?
that's
Can we
right.
continue on the plane that we're on? And if there's more and more people adopt just AI. Remember, just because you're adopting AI, all the other things are adopted as well. The entire stack is completely um, utilized. So, what is that going to lead us to? Is the big question.
So I want to start off how it is that I'm empathizing with the decision makers, right? You started off this whole thing with the decision support, and decision support that will be technical until that decision support becomes all technical. We have to rely on our human instinct, our human teammates to help us with the decision support. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now is a lot of standstill. A lot of standstill is to going around asking questions to people like us, people like Grant, to say, what do we do? You have all these capabilities. How do I do this? Because you told me 10 years ago to be a software company. Prior to that, you just told me to be a website company. Prior to that, you told me something else. Technology changes every 10 years. How am I supposed to keep up with that? Because the systems that I've invested in back in 2020, now you're telling me it's obsolete. Now you're telling me that that system, if I keep using it for the next 2, 3 years, I'm going to be so far behind because the other people are picking up this new technologies because they didn't invest on technology back in 2020. Because they have these cloud capability that I didn't have as an advantage. What do I do? Right. So the empathy is just I would say in every conversation I'm having because I really feel the pain. This is not that easy because I can talk to Microsoft about what they do so cool, but when you talk about an enterprise that is not a software company, that is not a technology company, they probably serve milk. I don't know, whatever they do, they're not technology company. So if your main business is food, how do you keep up with technology and how do you do whatever you have to do to stay relevant in the competitive market for next 10 years to come? So I think it boils down to one thing. The business world is a gamble. There's no other way to say it. You literally are gambling, but because you are winning within the winner circle, it doesn't feel like a gamble. But when you start seeing pursed environment where a lot of people are winning, a lot of people are losing, which we haven't had happen until 2008, where you start seeing a lot of those banks that were failing, and everybody starts thinking like, wait, this was a gamble the whole time. We survived somehow, right? And a lot of people didn't, right? So would that circle repeat itself? I bet it will because the history repeats itself, right? So one of the things that we can do in this gambling situation is to prepare our people first of all, right? Give them that tactical agility to understand that the way we did business for the last 30 years, it's no longer is the case of how to do business anymore going forward. So if you want to stay relevant for the next 10 years, like Netflix instead of Blockbuster, um, you know, Blockbuster wasn't agile. Their people, definitely in the boardroom, wasn't educated, as we can tell from many of the books that have been written about Blockbuster. They weren't ready to adopt, and they had definitely positioned themselves to say, whatever gambling we're doing, we're going to win. Well, if you have the mindset, first of all, to say this is gambling and somebody's going to have to lose, I just don't want it to be me, you really have to get behind this idea that quantum is not here today, but what's the bridge between me and quantum today? How do I create that gap and shorten that gap over time? Is by data structuring and machine learning and AI. Because other name for if we don't have quantum in, let's say, 5 months or 5 years from now, only alternative that we will have is machine learning because that's the closest to the quantum computing we can get. And a lot of the things that quantum computing has promised, machine learning is already providing those, right? Machine learning is competing with quantum computing in many cases. So when it comes to quantum computing, a lot of people think of it as this a notions of like, you said AI for 70 years. How long have you been saying quantum computing for? But when it's exponential, the 70 qubit that turns into 300 qubit doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go to 600 next. It's going to go to thousands, then go to millions overnight, right? So the adoption of quantum computing will be far faster than machine learning and AI we've seen. But then again, like I said, the bridge between AI, machine learning, and quantum is that machine learning will be able to provide for the quantum services. So I think the hardware piece that we were talking about, going back to that, all at once the blockchain is processing that much data, so it can get up to 51% consensus. There are some solutions that are coming down the pipeline that I am really interested about, because instead of having 1,000 chips and 1,000 different software coding in between 1,000 chips, they are looking about a single board that can process all the information in one single chip. And I think that's going to be something interesting, because the reason a lot of the computing power happens is not necessarily data itself. It's that this pocket of data, how does it synchronize as it processes data? And that takes up a lot of the powers, and that takes up a lot of the bandwidths, a lot of the human talents actually that has to be involved in writing the software coding for in between chips processing. So things are evolving, things are changing towards AI, and that's the point of this whole discussion here. The hardwares are shifting towards AI. So if you think AI is something that you can stand by on and wait on, you have to look at Intel, how many NMs of semiconductor chips that they're developing, and what does that NM specifically do, right? Even if you do 7nm with IBM's North Pole, you have a bunch of these capabilities that are coming in that are all AI based, right? So that's your telltale sign of what it is that you have to do as an organization to move forward in adopting AI, right? You always have to go to the train. Like I said, I empathize with the fact that people said, oh, become a data company, become a software company, become an IT company, right? No matter what you do, become this. Now people are telling you to become an AI company. I don't think that's the case. I think it's always the case of, do you have your infrastructure ready for the data to flow through it? And if you do, how do you develop AI on top of that, right? So there's a lot of mixed messages out there, but the message is clear on my side. If you've done what you've done previously, you just have to do it a little different. You don't have to change clothes at this point, right? You just have to kind of keep doing what you've been doing, but do it with the precision like Intel. Well, they're all going into AI, right? They're developing all their hardware to AI. So if you're a food manufacturer, you maintain your food manufacturing, but you have to change your infrastructure for this AI machine learning development. So I'm going to leave it at that. But there's a
I
lot of
wanted to
excitement in the
piggyback
hardware
on that just
space.
a little bit there, because we didn't talk about this, but you've alluded to it in everything you just said, is that infrastructure change. Start thinking about edge AI, and understanding that. And I don't know if we talked about this. I know me and you have talked about it a little bit. Is that right now AI, the larger as we understand AI, is more in the public domain than it is in the private domain. And as it makes its way into the private domain, meaning this simple analogy, everyone, you have the internet, and then you had intranets. Intranets are something that you utilize within your own enterprise, right? That you own that data, you own that. Well, that's happening in the AI world. You have to have that because of cybersecurity, things like that that you talked about. You don't want to share all that information out into the public domain. You want to have your own private information, your own private AI, and getting into edge AI. I think is going to be what you're going to hear about more and more. We're never going to get to what we call autonomous machines. And I know you talked about this like a Tesla. There's a lot of Teslas out there. And these Teslas are actually robots that are in an intelligent machine. Am I right?
Exactly. And I want to go back to your analogy of how you mentioned the electricity that used to live in your basement. And if you had electricity in your basement, your house was lit up, nobody else's house was lit up because they didn't have electricity in their basement. But eventually, when we distributed, that allowed everybody else to have power sources. And now the factories and every homes pretty much have electricity because city controls the power grid. So same thing happened with cloud. And I love that analogy because that literally described what data used to sit in the basement. Now it sits in a centralized location. So it's far more available. Um, Edge AI, I think, is the sort of opposite side of that analogy. It goes into, well, it used to sit in the data center. Now, how do you take that data and put it inside of your basement or in your attic? Because there's a concern that is coming up about safety, security, and privacy, right?
Yes.
So what you see with Apple Intelligence, what you're seeing with Microsoft NPUs that has 40 trillion processing power. So these capabilities that are coming online, they're to enable you for edge AI purposes. And edge AI is not necessarily something of a luxury; it's more of a necessity because if you process the data right then and there, it works much faster and it also is secure and it doesn't take up your internet bandwidth, right? So when Alexa has to speak back to you, it has to travel to Ohio first to figure out what it is that you asked. I'm just making up a point here, right? So wherever you are, data has to travel really far to bring you back the answer, the output. The configuration that we want today, the safety, security, and privacy, we can capture more in the edge AI, all safe, all secure, and all private, right? But we will have more of these cell phone towers like data centers that will become the distributed AI, where AI, the edge AI, will communicate afterward with these cell phone towers like data centers to say, hey, that was my last decision. What's the next decision and how can that be improved? Or what sort of the new information that you have that I should compile and compile and take into consideration as I make my next move, right? So you have tons of this capability, like you said, Tesla cars. If it's driving 80 miles an hour in North Carolina, by the time it hits South Carolina, it has to probably hit another tower, which is distributed AI, to help this AI to operate 80 miles an hour through South Carolina. And the roads might be different, the signs might be different, whatever the case is. So you have all this edge AI cases that are coming up. And I think CI CTOs, when I say that, they're going to the burner of like, hey, I already invested. What do I do next? Well, some cases we just call it that let the legacy die on its own. You're not going to have to replace it. You're going to really do something completely different, right? So these are some of the capabilities that are coming down the pipeline where you don't necessarily have to say, oh, transform from legacy to something else. No, there's no transforming. There's just literally let the legacy die. You're doing your business completely in a different manner that you don't need this legacy hardware anymore or any hardware at all, right? Because they could be that they live outside of your house in a distributed AI system, right? So whatever hardware that you have, whatever tools that you have, you might not have all this hardware that you have in front of you today. Like XR, VR, AR, they might not look the same in the future, but you will use them more extensively because they don't use that many hardware. They use multiple hardwares and eliminates majority of the hardwares, right? So your TV screen that you have in front of you that takes up all this space in front of you, you might not need that anymore. Just like keyboard, just like voice AIs, right? All these capabilities that are coming down the pipeline, I think they will make the world of 2030 far different than world of 2024. And I'm very excited for it.
Oh, me and you both. We're just now scratching the surface. I truly believe in understanding what can happen. It's like I've seen so much tech change over my lifetime. To your point, where I remember the first cell phones were like they were huge. Now they're just in the palm of your hand. Or you were like you're pushing. But I saw a movie the other day where they actually had a dial-up phone. They were actually dialing a phone number using a rotary dial. And you're like, what the heck is this? Or our kids are like, what are you talking? But that's how you did it. But to your point now, the cell phone becomes, I can see it be totally different in the future because everything's voice activated now. And you've got speakers in so many different places that you don't necessarily maybe not need a physical device to walk around with it. You just summon it. You could have your house might be an AV house. You think audio visual is what I'm talking about, where it's all there. Like so your TV anywhere can be your television. That you feel like you want a projection because you have projector. You can do it. So it'll be interesting to see how this happens. I remember when software as a service was this big thing. Like everybody used to go to to the store, right? And you got your Microsoft, Office, desk, at your
Right.
Best Buy or whatever, and you took it home and you plopped it in your computer. Who does that? You don't need to do that anymore. So said the physical layer could be a completely different animal that will most likely be unrecognizable in the
and
future.
and that's and that's better in many ways. Like one of the things that I said about AI, machine learning, and quantum is that the way to prepare for quantum is through machine learning, but it's not really something that we can say that you will need quantum, right? Because quantum is like almost like an ocean. You don't need to live in an ocean; you live in a land, and that's where the zeros and ones are.
Mhm.
Quantum is beyond zeros and ones. Quantum is natural way of processing information, where in zeros and ones there's a lot of gates, that on and off gates, right? So you have to consider quantum to be so far out. But when you think about that hardware piece of it, it's really is unfathomable how many technologies that we have around us that uses semiconductor chips.
Yeah.
If you want to start collecting, I think this one has 16, right? And then you can start counting from there. So if you start eliminating the semiconductor chips that you don't use anymore because there's one or two powerful ones that does majority of the work, do you think in your imagination that companies and corporations and consumers are not going to fall behind that, right? They're all going to go into it and say, wow, this one is far more efficient. It uses less electricity. And the data that's being processed doesn't need data centers everywhere on the corner. It literally processes inside this device in the semiconductor chips. A single IoT becomes multiple things all at once. Who wouldn't want that, right? And that's the world that we're heading towards with all this data processing capability that you are seeing, especially with AR, VR, and XR, right? And Siri as a voice AI and Google as a Gemini, coming through the phone. You have all sorts of capabilities coming down the pipeline. So future, as it sounds, as we're making it to be, it's sort of like that quantum discussion. You think it's an ocean, but it's actually what you need in the land, right? So how do you transform the ocean into a land? I guess that's the analogy here,
Yeah,
but
we're still a little bit
as
ways away. I think I like where you're going with that, but we're getting into different terrains and
that's
different
right.
and but the whole point is you have to use different tools to enable you to get to different points in time and space or whatever
Uh-huh.
it may be.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah,
your digital framework gets you to this point. I remember when we were using analog before we went to
that's
voice
right.
RP. We went analog, then we went digital, and then we went VoIP, right? And so as we look at these platforms that we're talking about, we have this tremendous digital world that we've kind of like got to our point. Now we see this quantum that's out there. It may not be what you can utilize immediately, but you start to see what can it do that we can't do. We don't just need to solve the same problem in a different way, but not really get a different result. Just because you can do it that way, does it really give us something different? I used
Right.
to ask that question on blockchain. I used to ask that question, like, well, all right, so we put everything. So what exactly do we gain out of that? And they're like, and the result was very minuscule. Like, well, that's not a game changer. That's a nice to have. It's cool, but is it a game changer? That's where I see AI is a game changer. And I get back to what I said earlier about having intelligence being ubiquitous throughout the human kingdom and not just in silos. Now you can get access to information, different ways of looking at different ways that you never could before. Now, we're not going to get
That's
into all
right.
the AI biases and
Yeah,
other stuff that's out there. We're just talking about where this technology can truly go as it
that's right.
consumes more and more of the human culture and can do things at scale better than we're seeing right now. We're in I would say AI 1.0 really. But when we get to 2.0, we really can see where this is
Right.
going. I see the fabric of our educational systems changing because now we just not want to look like, what do you remember about what I said in this lecture? No, I need you to truly understand and really map out a process, to your point earlier, a process to why you get to the right answer. I'm more interested in your process and your thinking than you just remembering a right answer.
I think so. Anybody who's listening and you want to continue these sort of dialogues about water, the electricity, the data centers, AI, your device, and your brain, if you want to have an expanded conversation on these topics and understand it from our lens of view, and it's not a specific product, is about the full forest, right? These days, I call it a lot about missing the forest for a tree because that's what's happening with AI 1.0. People are not seeing the full forest of AI capabilities. They're just seeing what's being promoted by the big marketing spending, right? So, Smart AI community is our community, SMART, which stands for Specialist Methods, Advocates, Research, and Training. We want to advocate for a safe AI that is good for our ecosystem where nobody's getting dry and not having electricity for blackout because somebody else is there using their electricity for AI purposes, or a specialist that can understand AI from a perspective that they can advocate for their jobs, for their career, and their use of AI and use that AI with safety, security, and privacy in mind. So we really want a lot of methods and a lot of research, a lot of training for these purposes. And a smart AI community is an open community where anybody who wants to learn AI from the perspective of how to do we advocate for ourselves, how do we advocate for an AI that is, for our benefit, not necessarily against us. There's a whole lot of research and training that's required, and a whole lot of understanding of the methods in the framework. And we do that through Smart AI community on a weekly basis, where people can learn about digital twin capability, business process mining crawlers, NLPs, natural language processing, any of the acronyms that you can throw at us, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about HITL, human in the loop, right? We have lots of acronyms to cover, but we cover very in depth for a wider set of audience, not necessarily for the techies, but techies and non-techies alike. So,
Awesome.
Grant, I know it's been a long day for you, sir, and I really appreciate you making the time to come to the podcast and continue this conversation. But before you go, please promote yourself. Like, how do we get in touch with you, and what sort of five-star BDM customers are out there that don't know about you?
Well, thank you again for having me on the show, Ashif. This is wonderful. This is what I like to share. I'm about sharing knowledge to help our anyone out there that wants to seek this type of information to get it and be able to utilize it to improve their community. So I love the smart community that you're doing. I have my own community myself at Five Star BDM. That is B for brand, D for development, and for masters.com. And I do a lot for helping small to mid-sized businesses and entrepreneurs to adopt these kinds of technologies, whether it's AI, but it's not just technology of itself. It is about the how do you marry business, or be more like brand, business, and technology to enable a certain result. If you're looking for business development, you would want to work with me. If you're looking for personal branding, how do I promote myself? Just like now, you are consuming the Grant McGaugh and Ashif brand. What are we about? What is our thought leadership and what we're passionate about? And how do we do this at scale? And how do we become consistent at this to build a different community and have a different result? That is what Five Star BDM is all about. I do have my weekly podcast as well. It's called Follow the Brand. I just had Dr. Akash on. He's about explainable AI. You're like, what is that? Explainable AI. Well, that's getting into causal AI. I mean, gets into understanding. It doesn't just give you a result, it gives you the understanding of how it got to that result, which is so important. He does a lot with breast pathology, and having this kind of support is critical because most people don't realize that through the different scans of radiology, when a woman goes through breast cancer or having a breast scan, that 50% of the diagnosis is could be wrong. 50%. So when you're going to have an AI take a look at that same type of framework and be able to and be able to pinpoint within 99% accuracy, now that's a game changer, and that's what I look for. I look for game changing technology processes that can actually change our human outcomes. And I do that a lot. I just had Dell on my show, and Dell was talking about the things that we talked about a little bit earlier around what is the compliance going to look like around AI, because you have so much that can be changed and morphed. Whether you get Scarlett Johansson voice, right? Like, wow, somebody can just duplicate that. That's, amazing. But you got to think about this. We've been able to record someone's voice 50 years ago.
That's right.
That's not new. It's just how to deploy it these days to actually mimic somebody at that kind of scale and accuracy has not been done. So I help people to understand how you can utilize these tools for the greater good. And not just, like I said, AI. I work from the human element, and I look for what you're trying to accomplish to grow your footprint.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody got to sit down and break down convolutional neural network and generative adversarial network. And I had to go through that learning process myself. But I'll tell you what. Once you go over that hump of what you don't know, and now you know, you start thinking differently and you start doing things differently. So that's what I think the smart community and BDM community is enabling people with information of what it is that you don't know, but once you know, what are you going to do differently? So
That's it.
Grant,
That's it.
aye, sir. I will see you.
Aye, 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 aye.